everyone for coming out on a beautiful sunny day, our first one in several weeks it feels like. I really want to give a special thanks to the Community Center, to Walter, to all the support staff for making these brown bags happen on a regular basis. And as Walter mentioned, this particular project is the result of a faculty fellowship that I received last year. So it's very preliminary. I'm still working through the data. I only have my first part of the pilot interviews done, and then I'm regrouping right now and restructuring the interview guide, and hopefully I'll have something more to report next year. So in this talk, I want to focus on workplace expectations, what the employees that I interviewed talked about, but with a specific eye towards flexible work arrangements, and I'll explain what that means in a few minutes. We often hear about flexible work arrangements. It's in the news. It's debated quite often. Some of the most famous cases are the Best Buy case, where they tried implementing a just get your work done work culture, but it was unsuccessful. It met lots of resistance by both women and men employees. Marissa Mayer, who's the CEO of Yahoo, gives you the flip side, where she called all the workers back to the office and got rid of flexible work arrangements. And so it's something that's hotly contested. And particularly in an economy that requires workers to be on 24/7, flexible work arrangements was something that companies started trying to implement as a way to get workers to do more and to retain high talent workers. Gotta have my clicker. All right, so today what I'm going to talk about is I'm just going to give a brief introduction about workplace characteristics, something we call the ideal worker norm, and then some data, and then I will move into what flexible work arrangements are, why we should actually care about them, the methods, and the findings. I'm going to focus on 4 aspects. Flexible work arrangements, again, within this competitive work culture. Are they available? Are they uniform? How does the supervisor or management matter? And then what about this flexibility stigma? And then I will conclude with some implications. All right, so to set the stage. Workplaces have changed significantly over the past couple decades, and it's been heightened since 2008 with the Great Recession. So typically when we think about traditional work organizations, we think about workplaces that are characterized by lifelong employment. Your parents have gotten a job and they've stayed in the same company for several decades. And often they left with something called defined benefits, which we know is gone by the wayside. They had a seniority career ladder, they put in their time, they moved up. They had specialized job descriptions, they had one task, they focused primarily on that, and loyalty was rewarded by these companies. And then the significant benefits came along with the full-time work, but there was multiple layers of management. In today's economy, and what you see in the literature, it's called the new economy, this has shifted quite a bit. So you have job insecurity. So you see a lot of downsizing, restructuring of companies, frequent job changes. Employees are bouncing all over the place, sometimes because they want to change jobs, other times because they've been forced out. Often it's temporary or contingent workers, which has an implication for benefits. They don't receive the same kind of benefits. It's a knowledge career ladder where it matters what your knowledge is, and I'll spend some time talking about that with my data. And multiple and shifting tasks. So it's not just this one job description. They have several things that they have to be doing. And they have to be able to shift really quickly from one position to the next. It's a 24/7 economy. They're tethered by the new technology. All of us have our fancy smartphones. Same thing happens in the regular workplace, outside of academia. Employees are rewarded if they're flexible and adaptable to the workplace. And there's diminishing benefits. And then teamwork and flattened hierarchies. So these are all pretty standard characteristics that you'll see in the literature that talks about how workplaces have shifted. And again, this has just been heightened, and it's been going on for about 2 decades, but it's been heightened since 2008. All right. So even though these workplaces have shifted, what hasn't changed is something we call this ideal worker narrative. And so what it means is that employees are expected to be on all the time and to live up to what seems like a gender neutral ideal worker, but it has real different gendered implications. So employees are expected to work long hours and be very visible. You'll hear it referred to as face time. And so that's what yields status and rewards. The work environment then requires prioritizing work, not family or other kinds of responsibilities. Sometimes you'll hear it not referred to as work family, but work life. And there's quite a debate in the literature and in the public discourse if it's work family, is it work life. Networking is absolutely essential, and this is what funnels employees into positions with greater decision-making capacity, higher pay, greater control of resources. but there's a differentiated value of behaviors and positions. So employees that are visible, employees that are ambitious, they're the ones that are considered heroic, and then those behind the scenes don't receive that same sort of value. All right, so what does this mean? I thought I would entertain everybody with some interesting slides and data for the middle of the afternoon. All right, so what this means is that often the expectation to work full-time is way more than 40 hours a week. Typically the literature refers to overwork as 50 plus hours, but anything above 40 hours, particularly for workers that are non-contingent, all right, so they're non-exemption, not non-contingent, non-exempt employees, exempt employees, I'm switching it around, right? The employees that don't get paid for more money if they work more than 40 hours a week. Right? So there's certain kinds of employees, they have the punch card, right? If they work more overtime, then they get paid maybe time and a half, depending on what it is, sometimes double time, depending on what the company does, if it's on a Sunday. But those employees that are expected to just work no matter how many hours it is. Right? So typically that's over 40 hours, what we see, and then again, that overwork threshold is 50 and above. All right, so this has become a feature that you see particularly in male-dominated workplaces. And by male-dominated workplaces, I mean where there's still the largest percentage of workers are men versus women. And it's also typically a feature that you find in high-level employees, so executive managerial level employees, and even first-tier managerial level employees. But what's happening over the past decade is that it's seeping down into those lower-level professional positions as well. So it's not just managers and executives that are expected to work more than 40 hours a week. It's also people in professional positions. Hold on. All right, so those who work, see I told you I had all kinds of interesting visuals today. So those who work these long hours are considered to be more productive, they're considered to be more committed, and they're rewarded again with this upward mobility, financial security, and recognition by their colleagues. Right? In contrast, employees that violate this norm are perceived as less committed to their careers, disadvantaged in terms of promotions, disadvantaged in terms of, of wages, and their reputation by their colleagues. So again, it's that perception that matters. So what appears to be this general neutral at first glance really isn't, because the conditions that enable women and men to actually live up to this standard vary quite distinctly. So women still, we know the data tells us, women still bear greater familial obligations even when they're employed full-time that hinder their career advancement in jobs requiring this complete devotion to work. So in workplaces that are valuing this overwork, whether it's just above the 40 hours or above the 50 hours, women are more likely to be evaluated poorly, they're less likely to receive opportunities for promotion, and they're more likely to leave their jobs than men. So this long hours work culture in these male-dominated workplaces combined with these traditional gender beliefs about work and family are reinforcing gender segregation. So we all know the result is something that we've been talking about for several decades, this glass ceiling. Right, so ideal workers then are supposed to be these rational, strong leaders, committed to work, and unencumbered by familial other responsibilities. So this work devotion schema requires that work becomes first, right? So work is to be given the undivided attention by the employees. And so built into the policies, whether they're formal policies or they're informal policies, which we usually refer to as practices, right? It values certain employee behaviors over other employee behaviors. All right, so how does this actually play out? Women are typically stigmatized by the motherhood penalty. And so when women have children, they're automatically perceived to not be committed to the workplace. Unfortunately, research is also telling us that even younger women who do not have children are often overlooked because there's a perception that they're just going to have kids eventually. Right? So now this doesn't mean that men are not stigmatized either, right? Men are expected to be good fathers. And by good fathers, we typically mean they're supposed to be good providers. And usually when we talk about that, we're talking about economic provision. Right? And so when men try to do something above and beyond being good economic providers to spend more time with their family, they too get stigmatized. It's just it happens more often to women than it does to men because of these traditional gender beliefs about how work and family are divided. All right, so this is how it plays out in the labor market. So the data on the women and men is from 1970, and then the data on mothers and fathers is from 1975. I couldn't find it any earlier than that. 75 is where they start tracking it regularly. So if we look at just the women and men from 1970 to 2013, women, and then again, this is all women working, so not whether or not they have children, is 43%, and then in 2013, it's 58%, so it has increased. And then, of course, for men, it was 80%, but it's decreased, and that is a decrease since the early, mid-2000s, and then heightened, of course, with the Great Recession. And then when we look at mothers, we can see 47% of mothers in 1975 were working. This is children under the age of 18, any child under the age of 18. And then in 2013, it's jumped to 71%. Now, if I break down the children, and it actually goes up to almost 75% for women who have children only between the ages of 6 and 17. So you're looking at women that have kids that are in school, K through 12. Right? But then it decreases for women who only have children under the age of 6, so they're not in school yet, right? And that's 65%. And then with fathers, it's remained consistent, right? So we see at 94% at 94%. It moves a little bit when you do that same bracketing of the age of the children. So men who have children between ages of just 6 and 17, it goes to 92.5%, doesn't really move much. And then those that have children only under the age of 6, it goes back up to that 94%. Okay, so now I want to focus a little bit on women, because what this project seeks to do is to look at advancement for women and how work-family conflict impacts that advancement. So this is only women, and I'm only using the Standard & Poor's 500 companies, and it's by race and ethnicity. So you can see overwhelmingly, right, white women outnumber, right, women of color, period, right? Although the white women's numbers are still low too, right? So, and it decreases significantly. So when you look at the total employees, it's 27%, it's almost an even split with the total employees in these first and mid-level officials and managers, and then it starts dropping off to 21% for the executive senior officials, and then drops all the way down to 4.4%. If I use the Fortune 500, it's essentially the same statistics. All right, so one of the other things with this, though, is that because the companies I'm looking at are only in manufacturing, I wanted to give some numbers about how it changes a little bit when we only look at manufacturing. This slide shows durable goods, so durable goods are your home appliances, your cars, anything that is intended to last. Toys are included a durable good. And so again, the percentages don't vary all that much, they do a little bit. So the CEOs, only 5%, the board seats, almost 18%, drops down to 19%, and then it bounces back up to this almost even split between the total industry labor force and then these first and mid-level officials, officers. Now, if I flip it to non-durable goods, and this becomes important, it is food, it's clothing, it's personal products, it is cleaning products, and the list can go on, but these non-durable. So non-durable is considered anything that would not have a shelf life more than 3 years. And that becomes important because the top 3 industries that have women as CEOs are food, retail, and I was surprised, it's gas and electric utilities. All right. But mining and crude oil has no women CEOs, and they have 33 of the Fortune 500 and Standard & Poor's companies. The largest company on the Standard & Poor's and Fortune 500 should not be a surprise. It's local, it's GM, and it's run by Mary Barra. Right? And so that becomes something important. All right, but so why do we care about these companies? We care about them because 5% of the Fortune 1000 companies have women CEOs, but these 5% are generating 7% of the Fortune 1000's total revenue. All right, however, if we look here and we look at what 19% for the executive senior level office officials and managers, that number in some ways is deceiving because they are all concentrated in HR, IT, and finance. All right, only 3% of CEO managers, or I'm sorry, plant managers at that executive manager level, that senior level, only 3% are in charge of manufacturing. right? So it's rare that women are in positions that deal with P&L, with profit and loss. So they're not dealing with the revenue, right? Instead, they're these support positions, right, in finance and HR and IT, rather than making the decisions. So, flexible workplace. I looked all over the internet trying to find a picture that talked about flexible workplace with men with a kid. I challenge everybody here to find me a picture. I spent hours trying to find a picture. It was always men on their couch, men at the beach, but women almost always had a child with them. All right, so this idea of the flexible workplace then is trying to figure out how to balance work and family, right, that intersection of work and home and life. So what do we mean when we talk about flexible work arrangements? We mean a lot of different things. It's how, when, and where people do their best work. It's flex time and place, right? So regular flex time that's available, that's systematically implemented in the workplace, or it could be short-term, short notice flex time. It's flex careers, so dialing up or dialing down. So there might be a point when somebody needs to step back for a couple of years, often because of children or an illness in the family, and then they can dial it back up. Reduced time, so working less than 40 hours or even going down to part-time or part-year work. Time off, paid vacations, and sick leave, paid sick leave. That's been in the news quite a bit lately. Good luck, that will eventually get that passed. And then choices in managing time, so schedule control, or shift trading, or coming up with an alternative schedule. And then, but importantly, none of these can be implemented without a culture of flexibility. And by that, we talk about supervisor support and a lack of penalties for working flexibly. All right, so why should we care about this very long list of things that I just rattled off? All right, we should care about it because polls are telling us that 4 out of 5 employees consider flexibility one of the most important reasons for taking a job or not taking a job. But only 1 in 5 employees actually has access to flex. All right, so the U.S. is the only country besides Papua New Guinea that mandates maternity leave and does not require employers to pay it. All right, that's our comparison country, Papua New Guinea. All right, however, right, long maternity leaves can also be problematic as well. So the research usually settles around 6 to 9 months where it starts negatively impacting women's wages and ability for promotion. All right. Most of the data tells us that although we hear it spoken about, and again you can see it in those pictures where there was women with the children, that it's a women's issue, flexible work arrangements. Although most of the people that capitalize on flexible work arrangements are men. And it's primarily because they're in positions that actually offer flexible work arrangements versus women. All right. And most importantly, what I'm arguing in this paper, or what I'm hoping to argue in this paper, is that flexible work, we should care about them because flexible work arrangements contradict that ideal worker norm that I was talking about, right? So you can't be visible if you work from home 2 days a week, right? You can't be the one that's called on at the last minute to do something if you're working from home a couple hours a week, or if your schedule shifts on a regular basis. All right, so how does this play out? So FWA is flexible work arrangements, right? The use of it is not congruent with the ideal worker norm. So what happens for women, right? Women leave work due to a lack of family-friendly policies, parental leave, protections for part-time workers, affordable child care, flexibility in scheduling and hours. We are so far behind the European countries, I'm not going to bother going into that. I'm pretty sure everybody sitting around the table actually knows that. All right. There's the motherhood penalty. Research is very clear in how it impacts women's wages. It's usually 15% for when a woman goes back to work. She's about 15% behind her male colleagues. All right, mothers are more likely to leave the male-dominated occupations when they work more than 50 hours a week. However, there's not this same effect when we talk about child-free women. All right, they're working the same as men. And in fact, research tells us that child-free women have similar attitudes towards work as men. All right, so what happens for the men? There's this fatherhood premium where men who are dads are paid higher wages and more likely to be promoted, right? Because they need to be taking care of the family, that economic breadwinner role. All right, but when dads seek part-time schedules for childcare, they face harsher character judgments than moms. and when dads with caregiving responsibilities face more coworker harassment than moms or child-free colleagues, right? Because the expectation is that moms should be taking care of the kids, not dads. So if dads are doing that, then they're not fulfilling their breadwinner role. So essentially the message is, dads who use flex policies are not good workers or real men. All right, so this is some new research that's coming out. So one of the things I wanted to look at in this paper is, well, do my employees say the same thing? All right, so in a nutshell, you have this flexibility stigma. So it's this bias workers face from coworkers and employers when they signal the need for any flexible work arrangement. And there's been a business case made and research that's been done that shows that companies are more profitable, employees are more productive when they can work flexibly. Right? And so scholars are arguing that it's really not an economic issue that companies have not implemented flexible work arrangements. It's really a question of, they're calling it morality, right? So they're saying that compounding this, that the U.S. workplace, with few exceptions, still reflects this cultural model of the 1950s. And then compounding that is, it ends up being reliant on the direct supervisor or the management to interpret what flexible work arrangements even mean to begin with. And then this contradicts with these deep-seated roots in the U.S. of work as something that's a calling, right? That's elevated to something that has a strong work ethic in the U.S. All right, so what did I do? I've conducted in-depth qualitative interviews, and they focused on daily work experiences, work-family policies and practices, work-family strategies, and career aspirations. The inclusion criteria I'm studying up. Often as sociologists, we quite often study down. In this particular instance, I'm going up. So I'm only including women and men that are professionals, managers, or executives. None of these are all white-collar workers. None of them are blue-collar workers, even though I'm looking at manufacturing. All right, all of the people in the study so far have children, and that's where I want to keep my focus for right now. They do not have to be dual income earners. Out of the 10 people I'm going to talk about today, 9 of them have spouses. They're all married. 9 of them have spouses that also work outside the home as well. And so these are multinational companies with 500 or more employees in the Detroit metropolitan area, and I'll let you use your imagination as you can imagine what kinds of companies I'm looking at. So the questions that I'm going to focus on today were the ones that said, could you describe company policies to support working families? In what ways do you feel your supervisor or managers have supported your career? What about other employees? Asking for examples, whether they've supported or not supported, right? How could the employer or their direct supervisors do something different, right? And how these employees felt other coworkers or managers looked at those who engaged in flexible work arrangements. So I'm going to now turn to the first of my 4, oops, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to talk about my sample characteristics. All right, who are the men? So they're aged between 41 and 55. They're all white. My sample is all white, essentially. I'm working on trying to have a more diverse sample. All the men were married. They all have 2 kids between the ages of 1 and 25. 4 out of these 5 all have children under the age of 11, so they're all school-age children. There's only the 55-year-old man who's in the study. Both of his children are in their early 20s. All of them but one have a master's degree, and they've all been employed between 11 and 35 years. On average, these are high-earning individuals. On average, they're making $100,000 a year. All right, one of them is making $300,000. All of them have wives earning $75K. These are households that are making a lot of money. All right, the $300,000 is the only one that has a wife who stays home. All right, who are the women? 30 to 54, so slightly younger. 4 white, 1 white Hispanic. Again, they're all married. 3 have 2 kids, 2 have 1. Ages range from 17 to 25 months. All but 3 are under the age of 10. So the one has children who are in their 20s, and the other one has an 18-year-old daughter who just started college. 2 have an MB, a master's, and the other 3 have a bachelor's. Between 1 and 27 years. That 1 year is deceiving, though, because she worked somewhere else for 7 years. So she's had 8 years in the employment labor market. Again, these women on average make less than men, but they're still high earners, 87% or 87,000, with one earning 400,000. So I have a woman who's earning more than anybody else in my study. That's not usual, right? 3 husbands, they have 3 husbands that are making over 90K, 1 that is making less than 50, and then 1 making less than 75, so that becomes a little bit bifurcated. All right, so now on to my findings. So it's no surprise, they all talked about having to work, what the expectations were, that they had to work long hours and they had to produce results. That was not a surprise at all. All right, they talked about how they had to show ambition, and they did this through networking and being aggressive. They talked about being visible and FaceTime. One of my employees said that his job was to make sure that he got his butt in the chair before his boss did every day. Right. And they talked about obtaining business know-how. This is one of the more interesting things that my employees talked about. By credentials, I mean having a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, but they all overwhelmingly talked about what was most important was this business know-how. All right, so again, this knowledge career ladder. All right, but flexible work arrangements, of course, violate this FaceTime. You cannot be visible if you're working from home a couple times a week. So this has very real implications. Right? You employees that are given the opportunity to learn new things and gain this business know-how are those employees that are there on a regular basis and are putting in more than 40 hours a week. So the next few slides I want to talk about how the workers thought about flexibility and what those implications were for this set of competitive work culture expectations. So Isaac is an engineer and he's in a professional position. He says, our department is fairly intense. Since 2008, we work harder with fewer people. Typical work day is different. We are global. We are in as early as 5:30. I'm in at 6 at a regular basis. But I don't mind because it helps with flexibility later in the day. It is an addition shift. People don't leave early. It is just an addition shift. Early birds by 6, most by 7 or 7:30. So when he's talking about flexibility, he was not talking about leaving at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He was talking about how does he get his 9 to 10 hours in a day without having to stay too late into the evening because he has children. Right? So he's coming in at 6 o'clock in the morning. Kate, who's my high earner, she's my above 400,000. When you add in all her bonuses, she's probably getting about a $500,000. She said, if you want to be a better than average, you have to put in more than 40 hours. You have to know who your competition is, figure out the standard, and beat it. Why are they seen as high performers? Other than yourself, who's responsible for making your career. So again, the only way that you'd be able to move up is to be there visible regularly and working these long hours. All right, so flexibility within a culture of ambition, right? If you're a new employee, I would really stress the importance of networking. They always look for your character, leadership, aggressiveness. Aggressiveness seems to be one of the things they look for when promoting people. And this is Julie, she's in a professional position. Ideally, it's not considered a good thing if you stay in a job. You need to be able to move around every 4 to 5 years. Hands down, everybody told me that if you want to really move up the career ladder, you should not stay in a job at the short end. It should be 2 to 3 years. At the absolute long end, no more than 4 to 5 years. Right? It would be good that you're the one sent to present so that it represent your boss and so other managers can see you. All right. Actually, I want to go back here. So this is Kim. She was an engineer. When she was telling me about this, she was really frustrated because she had just gotten her annual review. And so her annual review gave her these really great evaluations and said that she was one of their best workers in this particular position that she had. But the problem was nobody knew who she was. Right? So her managers didn't know who she was. And so she got dinged on leadership because nobody knew who she was. So she ended up getting an unsatisfactory performance evaluation. So this becomes important when we talk about this knowledge, what I'm calling the knowledge career ladder. So Jacob, he's in finances, he's a professional. He says his recommendation is that you get to know as many areas, many jobs. Those that move up have to have a lot of company know-how. Management needs to know you. You can see the repetition, it's like over and over again. You don't want to be too oriented toward one technology. So my manager had me do more and move me to a position that would introduce me to new technologies at the firm. Again, this is Kate, that high earner. In fact, her discussion tied directly to this knowledge career ladder because I asked her how important she thought it was. When I kept hearing this over and over again about company know-how, business know-how, and not about credentials, I'm sorry, Wayne State, you're not going to like what I'm going to have to say next, but I said, how important is it for people who want to move up to have a master's degree? She's like, it doesn't matter, right? What, I know, right? So she says, it gets you in the door, but that's it, right? So she says, I don't think it's important at all. I think it's overrated. She does not have a master's degree. She's 9 credits short of a master's degree. And she's number 3 from the CEO. She said, you can get there without it. You have these fancy degrees, which are great, but they're a guarantee of nothing. We are in a highly competitive environment, so it's much more. Education will always help. It will never hurt you, but it is certainly not a guarantee of anything. It's all about performance. Your attitude, your aptitude, IQ, commitment, and oh yeah, your education. It's all these things. And then she goes on and she connects it to this the job insecurity that we are experiencing today in the U.S. economy. Competitiveness is a longer-term trend, but it's been heightened since the Great Recession. Now there's no security. So when I'm forced to restructure and reduce my labor costs, I think about what kinds of skills and knowledge I need to retain and who has them. You have to outperform, because if you're in the middle, you're likely to go. We red circle those that are best in their job and their division. If you banged it out of the park last year, that's great, but if you got an unsatisfactory on your performance, you better know that you're on the list to be cut. All right. So she really puts the ballpark, though, in the individual employee. So it's up to the individual employee to figure out how to seek these things out, right? How can that individual employee gain this business know-how? And she wasn't the only manager that talked about it, right? So Mitchell said the same thing. People have to become responsible for their own careers, right? This is really different than that seniority career ladder where you just put your time in and you automatically moved out. This is moved up. This is something quite different. So this means you have to think about what you want to do, get the training, and get lined up. If you want to go further, you're going to have to be willing to move even internationally. And so when managers talked about those that moved up, they talked about setting out a plan almost a decade before they would actually start making these shifts. So this isn't something that you can be working for a few years and say, all right, now what do I want to do? It has to be strategic from the get-go. Start to figure out how it is that you want to move up and where are all the different possible positions that you're going to need to learn how to do in order to be able to advance. All right, so finding 2. All right, so is this even available and how is it available? People were all over the map. So out of the 10 employees that I interviewed, only 4 had some access to flexible work arrangements. So that's not even half of the people I interviewed. So, and it differed even within companies. So I've interviewed some people that work at the same company and they have vastly different things to tell me. So this is Isaac. He's an engineer and a professional. He says people can work remotely, but it's really contingent on where you work and what your work function is. It's become much more prevalent to flex work, right? In his department, they might be able to work max a half a day a week, but it might be 3 days for some groups. What makes a difference is in my group, we need face-to-face contact. Our function requires a lot more interaction in the office. So in his particular case, he never works flex time. Every once in a while, he'll take a half a day if there's something going on at the school or there's something up with his kids, but rarely is he able to take any kind of flex time. The 3 people who were in finance who happen to work for the same company, none of them have availability to flex time. It would only be this rare instance where there's a snow day, where their children got sick or something was going on. All right, Julie, on the other hand, does have access to flex time, although it's really minimal. She can work 2 days a week from home. She finds it beneficial as a working mother. There are those that use it just to get out of the office. Some people use it for a doctor's appointment that day and just work from home. In my case, I use it when my kids are sick or there is a snow day. Now, I interviewed somebody else that works at the same company who said, we don't have flexible arrangements. All right, so again, it varies even within companies. And then Kate talks about how it's not a formal policy, but if a manager wants to implement flexible work arrangements, they can. So she said our company doesn't have a formal policy, but it's arranged on a case-by-case basis. Often the arrangements are temporary. So this is where you see that dialing up or dialing down case. And so it would be something that's short-term versus it being a permanent way to work. And then other employees said, right, doesn't exist at all. Management's not interested in it. So Sam, who's a senior buyer, he's in a professional position, says there's a big mistrust in our department with senior management. We have 1 or 2 that work from home once in a while, but the senior management has a lot of mistrust, so there are no flexible work arrangements. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about, I want to give 2 quotes from the 2 out of the 3 managers who both say that they do set up flexible work arrangements for their employees, and then I'll move into the flexibility stigma. So in this case, this is Mitchell. He is a manager. He's the one who's 55. He's been working for 34 years at the same company. So he says, the company allows flexible work arrangements. I should note, he also happens to work at the same place that Isaac works, who I just talked about 2 slides ago, but they work in completely different positions and actually at different physical locations. So the company allows flexible work arrangements, but it's up to the manager and how they want to handle it. Each determines what is the best way to work the flex depending on their department. Across my division, we're all issued cell phones and laptops, which makes flexible work much easier. So he says to his group, I know people are social at work, and if that is a problem, then work from home, or work somewhere else, or hide somewhere. Whatever it takes, just let me know where you are so I can get a hold of you. So he supervises 15 people. He has all of them on different kinds of rotating schedules, right? That allows for them to work flexibly. He doesn't really much care where they are as long as the work is done. So this is Kate. It's informal, it's up to your supervisor. She set up numerous flexible work arrangements, but she couched it as you generally know who your good performers are and who is going to take advantage of it. So she doesn't do it for everybody. She does it for those people that she knows are going to actually be doing the work, whether they're in the office or they're outside the office. Generally, people work harder because they want you to know they're not slacking off. It's very evident when someone is not doing their job. So I'd rather give someone the opportunity to try it out. And then the third manager, high-level manager that I interviewed was the finance person, and it just is not part of that workplace culture at all. And one of the employees that I interviewed that works for the same company was the one that said his job is to get his butt in the office before his boss every day. All right, so flexibility, stigma. Out of all the women I interviewed, with the exception of Kate, who was that high-level executive, only one of the women that I interviewed talked about having access to flexibility. That was Julie, the purchasing, would work 2 days a week. And so when I asked her how she felt it was impacting her performance and her relationship with her boss and the coworkers, she said some groups are okay working from home twice a week. But I feel like there's this underlying, you hear people say family first, but there's pressure and expectation of why isn't this person at work today? And why is she working from home? We have this benefit, but you have to follow through. If you mean family first, then stand by your words. I just don't think it is accepted everywhere. I feel it is both at the manager and coworker level. My manager, she somewhat doesn't believe in it, then why allow it? You make me feel guilty when I do. All right, so what happens when the dads want to take it? So I have the involved dad, this is how they're calling it in the literature now, the new involved dad. All right, so when they try to dial back, when they try to work less than 40 hours a week, none of the women I interviewed work less than 40 hours a week. A couple of the men that I interviewed work less than 40 hours a week. They're supposed to work 40 hours, but they're not living up to those 40 hours. So this is Jacob. I'm going to talk about 3 men, right? Actually, this is Sam. This is Sam. So I'm going to start with Sam, who works for a company who also has a location in Germany. And in the German newspaper, there was a write-up about how this company was being lauded as a flexible work arrangement company, and they were doing all these great fabulous things. So Sam goes into his manager and says, well, hey, it's the same company. If they're doing it in Germany, why can't we do it here in the US? So his manager says, well, it's not been done before, but I'm willing to do it if you can get your work done. He told everyone I was going down to 35 hours. This was 11 years ago after the birth of his first child. Right? But the workload was the same, and I even got more on top of it, which was the funny part. The company got a good deal out of it, and I was paid less. Right? After a half year, my review got really bad. It was amazing that all of a sudden it is saying I don't have the know-how for a job that I've been doing for 11 years. There was a big push from senior management, and his direct manager said, you're going to have to go back to 40 hours because 35 doesn't work here. I thought, this is a really bad review, so I'll go back to the 40 hours, but where do I stand? He still works for the same company, but he's doing the minimal that he needs to do to get through. Right? So then the next dad, he says, there's a level of jeopardy based on my ability to service my kids. All in all, my boss is really understanding. He's been great to work for. My recent review, we were talking about careers, and you know, there are not too many jobs in the company that would allow me to work how I do. So if I wasn't working in the job that I have right now, with the boss that I have, I don't know if I would stay with the company. I would want a job that lets me be home with the kids. All right, and then last one, this goes back to Isaac, my engineer. He says, I'm sure I'm not typical on this. I have always enjoyed my time away from work, and I would like to keep that balance that we had before kids. It's important to me. It's important to my spouse. This is the ultimate division, and everything put in front of me for the next 5 years, I would want to play into that kind of balance. There are some roles where they work on the weekends and late. I'm not interested in that. In 5 years, I would like to be my leader's role, but quite honestly, if the demands are too high and the pay increase isn't logical, then no. It's quite likely he won't move up much because he's at the top, where the next jump up would be in management. There's no way you can be in management in a U.S. corporation and not put in a 50-hour work week. Now, he's also the one that's already putting in a 50-hour work week, right? He's the one that shows up at 6 o'clock in the morning. All right, so conclusions. So U.S. businesses are predicated on this idea of flexible accumulation. So when there was a shift from Taylorism to flexible accumulation, it is we produce what we need just-in-time production, right, rather than having this back pile of all these durable goods. And so they also need employees that are adeptly responding to quickly changing circumstances. Right, this ideal worker norm persists. It's very clear the way the employees talked about it. Long hours, you need to produce results, you need to be ambitious, network, be visible, and this knowledge career ladder versus seniority. All right, so there's a mismatch between this 1950s Mad Men workplace culture and the reality of the workforce. And so what this means for the employees that I've interviewed is that not all employees have access, even within the same company. Right, there are several contradictions going on. Right? So the lack of systematic implementation of policies leaves them open to interpretation. Right? Not living up to the ideal worker norm, you're going to have wage loss, lack of promotions, negative performance evaluations. Right? We know that. There's a whole body of literature that tells us if you don't live up to the ideal worker norm, this is what's going to happen. What we're now finding is that preliminary results, at least in this study, say that using flexible work arrangements exacerbates employee evaluations, right? Turns them down negative, and opportunities for promotions. Right. There's this motherhood penalty versus a fatherhood premium, but some of the results coming out of this study so far suggest that flexible work arrangements for men might have similar impacts as it has for women. And so once I get more interviews, I'll be able to tell you if that holds constant, or was there something about these first 10 pilot interviews that I conducted. And that's it. Thank you.
Dr. Brumley,
nice to see you.
It is so good to hear this information 40 years later.
Oh, there you go.
I entered the corporate America, the world of corporate America almost 40 years ago. And I literally, on my interview, the hiring manager told me, we do not like hiring women because you guys get pregnant. He literally told me that. Now, rest his soul, he's deceased now. But 40 years ago, to hear that statement as a young woman really left me puzzled. Suffice it to say, I did get hired, but it was an interesting life in corporate America 40 years ago, and I can honestly say that nothing has changed.
Well, fair enough, right? But it has changed, right? So there are more women in the workplace. We could argue whether or not it's because you need 2 incomes in order to be able to survive. But we're not where I think we thought we would be.
Exactly, for 40 years. I can say there is one career field that may offer, from a contingent work perspective, the flexibility, if that's what you're seeking, and that was the field I ended up falling into, which was project management. But it was the kind of career field where 50 hours was the minimum. But by the same token, as a project manager, you could pick the projects, you got exposed to upper level managers, depending on the quality of the project and the requirement for the project. But when you got that exposure, you better know that you better be on your game every single day. Project management is not an easy job, but if you're looking for, and especially if you do it in manufacturing, you can do it in almost any industry. If you're looking for the kind of job, based on the education that you have, that you can get into and get that kind of exposure, knowing that you're going to be somewhat flexible with the hours, but it is going to still be demanding. That would be my sell. That was the only thing that actually saved me.
Can I jump in? The only problem is in your contingent worker and your contract worker, and you have very few benefits and no job security.
You're right.
Not that you have job security in a full-time position either with restructuring and downsizing, but then you're even more vulnerable.
And yes, that is contingent work. That is definitely contingent work, but, yeah. Thank you. I
You're
got you
welcome.
good.
I'm sorry it wasn't more uplifting.
No, it was good. It's good to hear that, to hear that, okay, so I wasn't crazy.
Corey, is that you back there?
Yeah, that's very tough. I'm thinking, I enjoyed your talk. I'm thinking about this flexible work arrangement, and I'm thinking about, I don't think companies, maybe some, but these multinational companies, the ones that are very successful, and of course, multinational corporations are highly competitive and successful. The idea of flexible work arrangements, to me that's interesting. It's a useful frame. It's a useful frame of allowing people to work outside the office and, by their own hours. But at the end of the day, they're concerned about productivity.
Yep.
And I'm thinking that if it proves, based on your data, it seems like people, it may be across the board, they need to be in the presence of other people to remain productive, so they can see other people that kind of motivates them to work. But if the model shows that people can be more productive or as productive, and it costs the companies less money to have brick and mortar and have parking lots and have offices, and people can stop in for meetings, and people can, like, for example, my brother works at GM, he's in marketing, and they gave him a computer and a phone. I don't know how many hours a week he works, but they just want to get the work done. So he looks at consumer trends and purchasing of big trucks. So you could do that sitting downtown, or you could do that sitting at a dinner table or a coffee shop or wherever. I mean, but if it proves that it works, and it proves that people can still be highly motivated wherever they are, then I think you'll see more companies move towards that. I don't think it has anything to do with gender. I mean, I don't think the companies are making a point of, we're going to do this so we can be nice and women and be more helpful, so we can be more family oriented. I don't think they care. I think they care about.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I think they care about making money.
Exactly.
And so if
I thought you were going somewhere else with that car.
I think they care about money. If people can be productive or more productive, or the fact that they can save money by not having brick and mortar offices and parking lots and stuff like that, or people don't have to make the 30-minute, 40-minute, or whatever, truck to get to work and back home, whatever. They'll do it, and it can be under the frame of, we're family oriented. But really, at the end of the day, no matter what they say, it comes down to, does this work? Does this make us money? Does this make us more competitive? Does this give us an advantage over the next company? But flexible work arrangement seems like a nice frame to use. So I mean, to me, that's what's going through my mind, and perhaps 15 or 20 years down the road, they'll figure out a way to make this more productive. At the moment, based on your data, it seems that if people are being penalized for not being there, but perhaps because they're not as productive, they're really not as productive as people that aren't there. I don't know.
Well, there are a couple things, right? So we know it saves companies money, right? And for a number of reasons. One of them is that employees are more productive, so they get more work done, right? But it's that same, that brick and mortar that you're talking about, so they're able to actually save overhead costs, right? So it's not that being in the office motivates people to work, but that employees are evaluated and perceived, right, as being a good worker or not a good worker based on whether or not they're in the office, right? And so even though companies know that this is a way for them to save money and make more money, it's coming up against these very traditional gendered beliefs about what work should be. Right? So until there's that cultural shift and you don't have managers or supervisors saying, well, I think employee X is a better employee than employee Y, and it's based on perceptions and assumptions about who that employee is versus something objective, right? Then women are discriminated against much more.
Last comment, and I'm done.
Yeah.
I think that probably, I mean, that is the case now, but I'm thinking like 20, 30, 40 years down the road when it becomes much more normal. So I mean, you're already seeing commercials like, you know, Skype meetings and, you know, those online meetings and stuff. Once that becomes, I think, much more normalized in the same way, you know, the new technology becoming more formalized, and over time, this consistent increasing in profits, if it shows it to be true, that quarter after quarter after quarter, this is the way to make money. Then I think cultural normal shifts if the profit margins consistently get larger, and these companies can consistently outperform companies that you got to be here. If that happens, that's what I'm saying. I mean,
Yeah.
this is just a cross section right now, but like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it will be interesting to see 20 or 30 years, and where technology is going in 20 or 30. I can't even imagine. I mean, if you think back 30 years,
Right.
for those of us who can remember 30 years ago, right, and not having all the fancy technology that we have,
Right.
I can't imagine where we'll be in 30 years. So it will be interesting to see. I, of course, am not as optimistic as you. I'm much more pessimistic. Sorry.
Sorry.
I don't know, Zach, was your hand up for, or Janet?
I was just going to note that I think an interesting concept is control, both on the part of the manager as well as the employee. Because if you're not working in the office, they have less control over you, but you as an employee have more control over the scope of your work, and that leads to more health benefits.
Yes, yes.
You know,
Right. We know when we reduce work-family conflict is better. I thought for Sharon was going to jump in here and say something about mental health outcomes. All right,
I
Zach.
would just add, I find the word very interesting, Krista, but I would just add that, I mean, you talk as if these flexible arrangements are all positive or across the board positive.
Fair enough.
But
Yeah.
there's got to be a threshold because you run the risk of dismissing cultural effects, like workplace cultural effects.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
we know that those have an effect on productivity, depending on the culture, whether they're positive or negative effects. So I would think that there would be a threshold of this flexible arrangement that would be beneficial for people, mental health, familial relations, and whatnot.
Right.
But beyond that threshold, I think it's going to be detrimental because you can't take workplace culture out of the equation of work.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Because
agree
work
with you.
itself is a collective endeavor.
Well, and then it runs the risk too, if people mainly work from home, and particularly you call into those call centers, you never know where they are, right? Are they sitting at their table? Are they sitting in a coffee shop? Where are they sitting? It becomes isolating, right? And so we see that with the maternity policy is a really good example. We need to have that paid maternity leave or paid parental leave, regardless whether it's the woman or the man that stays home, but there is a threshold. And we know the data tells us after a certain amount of time, has negative consequences. And so because,
It's just general integration. Labor
Yeah.
force is an important source of the integration and belonging.
yep, exactly. And so because flexible work arrangements are so new in some ways, we don't have the data to really be able to talk about that threshold just yet. But hopefully we will, and maybe I'll
That'd
have
be
some.
interesting.
I'll let you know in 5 years. Hopefully it won't be that long. Sure.
Just to add to what Zach said, the whole flexibility thing is fine and dandy, but after a certain amount it becomes work-family conflict and the boundary blurring, right? Like for us as academics, the fact that we get to have flexibility and working from home is great, but there is so much blurring. Like there is no time, there is no weekends for most of us, right? There is no evenings. So that flexibility is good because you get to do your laundry or pick up your kids, but at the same time you have to make it up. And sometimes just
Absolutely.
leaving work at 5 and not having to think about it is better to me than having that flexibility, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell, again, this argument all the time with people because as academics, oh, it's so nice you get your summer off. You can imagine what our response to my summers off are, which are non-existent, right? But I always say because we have flexibility, absolutely. We have autonomy to be able to make a quick shift if we need to, but what it essentially means we have flexibility to work 24/7. We are on 24/7, right? There's expectations from the larger universities, and Wayne State is not unique in this. You've You've got expectations from your colleagues to answer quick emails. You have expectations from your students. Sorry to all the students sitting here, right? To answer those students who have me know I'm up at 6:30 in the morning and I'm answering their emails, right? So it's this constant. If you go 2 or 3 days and you haven't answered an email either from a coworker or a higher up or a student, well, where have you been? And maybe you just decided to take a Saturday or Sunday off. So it's trying to figure out what those boundaries are, and that again then puts the burden on the employee, right? In fact, Kate, that high level person, she talked a lot about that. She gave me a great, her interview was amazing. This whole life history of how she was able to get to where she is in the company. And she said ultimately it comes down to learning how to say no. Right? Now she's high enough up that she can say no now, but she had a long period of time where she couldn't say no. But then the burden comes back onto the employee to be able to figure out how to do it, rather than it being something that's implemented into that work culture where it's okay if you don't respond right away to something. Right? Heather, I thought I saw your hand shoot up, or?
Yeah, kind of, you know, as you were talking, especially that one, I think engineer Sam, when he was talking, it made me think about the concept of conspicuous consumption, but almost as conspicuous labor or power, right, with the title. Like, his goal to go to management, you know, sometimes, like, I got pushed into a management, not pushed in, well, headhunted for a management position before I came here, but the trade-off was like a couple thousand more than I had been making, but then I was on call 24/7.
Oh, Isaac, the engineer who said, yeah, the money.
Doubled, yeah, and in the long run, I was like, why do I want this status or this title in order to like work 3 times as hard for like $2 grand more?
Exactly.
So I left, but you know, like I'm wondering, in his case, how much is related to that? Like, how much are people willing to sacrifice for this status?
Exactly.
You know, are these certain jobs that are allotted, you know, for their status that really are poorly paid, right? And, you know, these are some of the concessions. So I wondered how much was behind some of that that's promoting some of this.
Agreed. He's well paid. He makes over 100. He makes 125.
They're all
It was depressing. You go home, right? You enter in the data in the database to keep track, and I'm like, oh.
Well, a certified project manager can make over 100 to 100, you know, well over 100 grand a year, and that was 30 years ago. And a certified project manager, you have to take an exam and prove you've done so many hours of project management, if with a degree or without a degree. But when you got those PMP, those 3 letters behind your name, you could literally make up to 200 grand a year if you were willing to go where the projects were.
Well, but then that's the trick, right? So you saw in the case of Mitchell, who says, and Kate would have agreed with that as well, and so would the finance executive. If you really want to move up in the company, you have got to be willing to do an international stint.
Well, that's
right. So for most families, they are not going to be able to pick up and yank their kids somewhere, or depending on how old those children are.
But that's been a mantra for a long time. That's always been the case.
Well, it's increasingly so because you have these global companies, right? Where 40 years ago, we didn't have that same level of internationality and global.
Dr. Brown, just so you know, they did start the flexible work programs back in the 90s. It started back in the 90s. They did it for a little while. One corporation was Electronic Data Systems, EDS. They did it for about 10 years. Then they went back to the more brick and mortar. So this whole idea of flexible work arrangements has been in existence.
It's been around,
since
but when
late
you
80s,
see,
early 90s.
but when you see tech companies, right, which is a really good example
Which
of companies
EDS
that
was a tech
can
company.
do it, right? And so when you have Marissa Mayer from Yahoo saying, "Get your butts back into the office. We're not doing this anymore," and this was just within the past 2 years. It flips us back again. So while there's progress made, right, you see, and Best Buy, same thing. They got rid of their program. They tried really hard to implement this whole new work culture, and employees said, no way, because they're really not working at home.
Let me ask you this, do you think age may have something to do with that? That a more older or mature
No.
worker would be, you got some data on that?
No, yeah, one of the things that I was looking at was to see, because I thought it was going to be a millennial issue, right? That it would be the millennials that would really want this, and it's not. it was, I'm not gonna be able to find it quickly, it was held consistent across the life course of people wanting to have flexible work arrangements. And I think where you sit in the upper age range is that sandwich generation, right? They might still be taking care of children at home, but now they're also
And not
dealing
married.
with elder
Yeah.
parents,
Yep.
right? So it's still across the life spectrum.
So, I have
Yeah.
one more comment then. So,
Yeah.
so obviously, based on your own admission that this arrangement is not profitable for all companies, otherwise they wouldn't be reverting back.
Well, I think there's a couple things going on. It goes back again, it is profitable. I'm sure it's not profitable for all companies, right? But overall, it's been shown to be profitable, right? But I think the pushback is this idea of what work is, right? And these competing devotions of work and family. And we still fall back in the perception of if you're not in the office, you must not really be working. And I think academia is one of the only places where that's not necessarily the overarching theme. But I can tell you, I've worked at a university, not Wayne State, where I had to fight tooth and nail to convince my superiors that I was in the field doing interviews.
You think it has
Right?
something to do with the outcome? I mean, whether the outcomes are tangible or not?
I think
mean,
so.
Academics, we can tell whether you're working home or not.
Exactly,
without you
exactly.
being here.
Yeah, if you're producing, if you're publishing, if, you know, students aren't saying, I haven't seen my professor in 3 weeks.
So if your professors, they're
Yeah.
producing intangible outcomes, do you think that's less?
Or
likely
not
to-
as quickly tangible outcomes, right? And so if they're not measurable as quickly, then it becomes very much based on perception versus something that, oh, she just published an article. So, yeah, I guess she must have been out in the field doing those interviews, right? And I think that's gonna be contingent based on who your supervisor is, so who the chair is, from department to department. I'd be willing to bet if I did a study around Wayne State, it's gonna vary by discipline and then by whoever the chair is at any given moment.
Thank you.
Yeah, so sorry.